The Hellfire Club is one of the great historical curiosities, standing at the intersection of attention-grabbing factors because it has been linked with great power elites, its notorious reputation for debauchery, and figures such as Benjamin Franklin. Much of the club's reputation was augmented by gossip and sensationalism, but the real fact is that it stood at the juncture of those who wielded power, intellectual thought, and rebellion against conservative morality in British society during the 18th century. In the detailed narrative that follows, we're going to look into the very origin of the Hellfire Club, its infamous members, its rituals and practices, and the dark secrets unearthed, especially with regard to Franklin's association with the club. Origins of the Hellfire Club. The Hellfire Club emerged at a period of social and intellectual turmoil. The 18th century was the Enlightenment, which witnessed a burst of radical new ideas related to politics, religion, and the human condition. In Europe, but more especially in Britain, power structures, religious authority, and social mores were in flux. Secret societies, based on free thinking, skepticism toward an organized religion, and often on hedonistic principles, were popular during that time. The Hellfire Club was one of these many secret organizations that were created to explore such new philosophies in conjunction with various activities that would otherwise have been considered scandalous or illegal. The term Hellfire Club has over the years described several groups, but perhaps the most infamous group was that which Sir Francis Dashwood had formed during the mid-1700s. It was officially founded by the rich and eccentric aristocrat Dashwood as the Order of the Friars of St. Francis of Wickham, though most outsiders called it the Hellfire Club. Activities of this club were held at Medmenham Abbey, a former Cistercian monastery along the banks of the River Thames. This isolated and ancient location added to mystery and attraction to the group's activities. Indeed, the club involved many of Britain's most powerful men, politicians, nobles, and intellectuals who came together to reject the moral constraints of their time. Dashwood himself had grown up notorious for his libertine views and his disdain for the organized religion of his upbringing. The activities of the Hellfire Club frequently were performed with an initiation of deceitful religious activities, which would mock the Catholic Church, while they engaged themselves in drunkenness, feasting, and sexual activities. Although most of the more outlandish accounts about the club's occult practices are certainly exaggerated, it is accurate to say that the club's membership did consider its activities as challenging the boundaries of respectable behavior. The founder, Sir Francis Dashwood. Francis Dashwood was born into one of the aristocratic families with strong connections in 1708 and had been educated and raised like most of the English nobles. However, during his travels through Europe in his youth, Dashwood came in contact with many intellectual and cultural currents, which played an important role in his later life. During his Italian and French sojourn, he was imbued with the grand tour tradition among wealthy young men to explore the art, culture, and intellectual traditions of Europe. Dashwood became heavily interested in ancient pagan rituals and art. He was especially drawn to classical imagery of Bacchus and Venus, who both symbolized hedonism and sensual pleasure. The continental experience further poisoned whatever regard he might have for British morality. Back in England, Dashwood became known as a host of lavish parties and as someone with no regard for religious doctrine. He was Chancellor of the Exchequer and held many other political offices, but the main interest was reserved for the Hellfire Club, founded to gather a group of kindred spirits who saw eye to eye with his view of things. Under Dashwood's orders, Medmenham Abbey, where the club met, was restored and redecorated with lewd, often explicit classical imagery. The interior design of the abbey was to create a setting of licentiousness and intellectual freedom. The motto of the Hellfire Club was supposedly "Fais ce que tu voudras," do what you will, which expressed the idea behind the group of denying conventional morality in favor of personal liberty and pleasure. Rituals and activities of the club. The Hellfire Club's activities and rituals are designed to mock the excesses of religion. The members of the club often dressed in monks' habits, replete with mock religious titles, and conducted mock sacraments that burlesqued the Catholic Mass. The choice of using Medmenham Abbey as the meeting place is symbolic, as it represented the previous Christian worship site now perverted to host the Hellfire Club's sacrilegious meetings. One of the most infamous activities associated with the Hellfire Club was the enrollment of females, often described as nuns or sisters, who were imported for the purpose of the various rituals conducted. In fact, many were almost certainly prostitutes or mistresses, and their alleged involvement in these ceremonies only served to add to the infamy of the club. The nature of the rituals of the Hellfire Club cannot be determined precisely because so much that was written about the group comes from accounts many years later that could have sensationalized or exacerbated those events. But it would seem that the club was remarked upon for excessive drinking, feasting, and sexual indulgence, all against the backdrop of mock religious ceremony. Dashwood and his fellows also debated philosophy, politics, and religion, often on provocative or taboo subjects. The Hellfire Club was a venue where Britain's elites could practice free thinking without the threat of public censure. In that regard, the club was something more than hedonists. It was also a forum for the Enlightenment ideals of reason, liberty, and skepticism of authority. Benjamin Franklin, a complex involvement. Perhaps the most intriguing individual linked to the membership of the Hellfire Club was American polymath and one of the founding fathers of the United States, Benjamin Franklin. Speculation regarding Franklin's membership in the club has been continuing, particularly because of his close friendship with Sir Francis Dashwood. During his stay in London, Franklin stayed at Dashwood's house and engaged in some of Dashwood's pursuits, though the extent of his involvement in the Hellfire Club is not known. Franklin was posted to London as the colonial agent for Pennsylvania from 1757 until 1775. During this time, he became intimately acquainted with the great majority of Britain's intellectual and political elites, including Dashwood. Franklin had considered many of the libertine views advocated by Dashwood and the Hellfire Club, especially those relating to religion. He was a deist, believing in there being a rational and moral order in the universe, but limiting himself to dogma-organized religion. This philosophical aligning of Dashwood's anti-clerical stance has led some historians to speculate that Franklin could have participated in the club's activities. However, it is not certain, from any reliable account that has been left behind, that he was a member of the Hellfire Club or present at any of its scandals. Nevertheless, it is abundantly evident that there existed close ties between Franklin and Dashwood on an intellectual and philosophical level. In fact, Franklin's writing during this period would often mirror the kinds of ideology that were fostered by the Hellfire Club: liberty, free thought, and skepticism. The discovery of human remains at Franklin's house. One of the most dramatic and disturbing finds tied to Franklin's time in London came in 1998, when renovation conservationists at Franklin's former home at 36 Craven Street revealed a pit of human bones beneath the house. At least 15 were represented, including several children, and many of the bones showed evidence of dissection. This grisly discovery immediately sparked rumors that Franklin was engaged in some sort of nefarious or criminal activity, and that this might even be connected to the Hellfire Club. The more plausible explanation for these bodies involves one Dr. William Hewson, a good friend of Franklin's and one of the first anatomists. During the 18th century, it was a standard practice that medical students, for learning the intricacies of human anatomy, had to dissect cadavers. Then, obtaining bodies for dissections was highly contentious, and most medical schools obtained them through illegal practices, which included grave robbing as well. Hewson ran an anatomical school from Franklin's residence. While the bodies in Franklin's home are somewhat gruesome, the fact remains that Franklin himself did not participate in the dissection and/or acquisition of the bodies. More than likely, these were bones that remained from Hewson's medical study, conducted in secret because of the legal and moral constraints of the time. Political and philosophical impact. Yet for all its scandalous notoriety, the Hellfire Club played an important part in the intellectual and political life of Britain. Its membership was an assemblage of the most powerful men in the country, and its meetings allowed for freewheeling debates on subjects considered taboo for public consumption. In many respects, the Hellfire Club was the very definition of Enlightenment isolated, free thinking, and bound only by the constructs of its individual membership. Taking it holistically, the Hellfire Club appears rather a reaction against or even rebuffing, orthodoxy religion for hedonism at the onset of the burgeoning Methodist movement that swept through Britain. A charismatic founder was John Wesley, and Methodism emphasized personal piety, moral rectitude, and the primacy of salvation through individual faith. Against the explicit libertinism of the Hellfire Club, Methodism preached a return to simplicity, moral probity, and spiritual renewal. In the 18th century, Methodism arose to contribute to a further cultural divide between the forces of religious conservatism and the libertine ethos, which could be seen in secret societies such as the Hellfire Club. Whereas Methodism appealed to the working class and those disillusioned with the established church, the Hellfire Club drew in those elites who chafed against the strictures of organized religion and social decorum. To a certain extent, the two movements represented opposite ends of the cultural spectrum. Methodism had looked to provide spiritual guidance and community to the common people, while the Hellfire Club provided an outlet for the intellectual and physical indulgence of the wealthy and the powerful. These two features contrast, yet the two movements shared a central tendency in the Britain of 18th century: the challenge to traditional authority. The Methodists regarded it as that being applied to the Anglican Church, largely perceived to have become out of touch with the spiritual needs of common people. The attack that the Hellfire Club set upon moral authority happened through caricature of strict morality of the Church, and embracing libertinism philosophy that valued personal freedom and pleasure, combined with intellectual exploration more than religious or social conformity. The intellectual climate and shifts. Another environment in which the Hellfire Club operated was a political atmosphere that grew to become more and more defined by intellectual shifts of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment marked an age of astounding growth within the sciences, philosophy, and political theory. The influential contributors to the Enlightenment included John Locke, David Hume, and Voltaire, who were questioning the traditional underpinnings of power, such as, among others, the divine right of kings, the role of the church and the state. In that respect, one can regard the meetings of the Hellfire Club as nothing less than an indulgently amusing party, but also forums of radical thought. While most of their activities are recalled for gross excesses, members of the Hellfire Club were also participating in the intellectual and political debates of their time. These debates, quite several times, were conducted in secrecy, out of the reach of inquisitive public eyes and the dogs and cats of the law, thereby safeguarding the actions of its members, since they could mention those things that others would possibly consider seditious or even blasphemous. For example, Francis Dashwood was one of the pillars in politics when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer in the time of George III. Thus, his involvement in the Hellfire Club represented not a personal indulgence per se, but reflected his wider engagement with Enlightenment thought and his challenge to the status quo. Indeed, Dashwood and others of his kind viewed the rejection of conventional moral norms as part of a larger philosophical project, the pursuit of truth and freedom, free from the strictures of religion and society. Impact of club on British politics. Even though the Hellfire Club seemed to be an organisation that provided scope for indulging in people's pleasures and discussing philosophical ideas, it was also very closely tied to the politics of the day. Its members included some of Britain's most influential men, and the friendships they forged in the group often spilled over into the world of politics. Some of them held important positions in the government or enjoyed close relations with the royals. Their influence on political events was significant. One of the most astounding members of the Hellfire Club is John Wilkes, who was simultaneously one of the greatest British government critics. Wilkes was a radical politician and journalist known for advocating civil liberties and attacks against government corruption. A strong advocate of freedom of the press, his works frequently landed him in trouble with the authorities. Indeed, Wilkes's involvement with the Hellfire Club speaks to a wider engagement with contemporary political affairs. His activities would end up writing chapters in the eventual history of British democracy. Yet at the same time, its private nature and exclusivity rendered it also a site of informal political networking. During an era when public political discourse was highly circumscribed, secret societies like the Hellfire Club offered a haven where powerful men could discuss matters of state well beyond the prying eyes and ears of press and public. This made the club a place of hedonism, but also an important venue for the exchange of ideas and forging alliances that shaped the political landscape of 18th century Britain. The closeness to the seat of political power has led to much speculation that some of the activities which took place in the club might have had more sinister motivations. There have been those theories, for example, that the Hellfire Club was into espionage, political intrigue and manipulation. Some even believe that the privacy of the meetings allowed members to discuss politically sensitive issues and even plot against their rivals. Speculation is what the little concrete evidence to back it up translates to, and given the nature of the club, along with the interconnections its members had with the highest levels of British society, there is room for speculation. Social and cultural impact. The libertine philosophy of the Hellfire Club and its excessive behaviour had a great impact on the cultural scene at that time. The ridicule of religion and the excessiveness of the club were considered by many to be an attack on the moral fabric of society. To be more specific, the ceremonies conducted by the club, which were parodies of Christian ceremonies, entailed the consumption of vast quantities of alcohol and sexual activities by women. This was disgusting to the religious authorities of that time. However, this Hellfire Club is also part of a general cultural drift towards secularism and challenging the values of tradition. In this century, deism, a religious philosophy developed to serve the role of dogma for the hell of the organized religion by substituting reason and morality in place of the divine, began its ascent. The club members, such as Benjamin Franklin, were deists, and activities with the Hellfire Club can also be seen as part of their broader philosophical approaches. Franklin is particularly interesting in this respect. Primarily, being a deist, Franklin refused the interference of supernatural powers with human affairs. He believed that ethics must be rooted in reason and the pursuit of happiness. His close friendship with Dashwood and his likely involvement in the schemes of the Hellfire Club speak of the general involvement of Franklin with the intellectual and philosophical movement of the Enlightenment. But much of this was scandalous enough, and yet more than a little of this membership was seriously involved with the same intellectual and political debates that marked the end of one century and the opening of another. Not only a den of lechery, the Hellfire Club was also an intellectual and political laboratory. To that end, the Hellfire Club can be thought of as an integral part of the larger cultural expansion towards self-reliance and a lack of concern for traditional authority. The fall of the Hellfire Club. By the middle of the 1760s, the Hellfire Club had begun to disintegrate. Public scandals and the growing demands of moral authorities proved too much for the organization, while Sir Francis Dashwood himself began to distance himself from the hedonistic parts of the club's activities. However, the legacy of the Hellfire Club lived both in terms of its contribution to the intellectual culture of the period and in the constant fascination which it was able to provoke in later generations. The decline of the club thus marched hand in hand with the growing influence of a much more formal political movement, radicalism seeking to upset that established order by means far more direct. Men such as John Wilkes, who had previously joined in the libertinous rituals of the Hellfire Club, began to focus on more urgent matters concerning politics, the fight for civil liberties, and the drive toward parliamentary reform. Meanwhile, the broader cultural trends with which the Hellfire Club had been associated continued to shape the intellectual landscape of both Britain and Europe. The lack of traditional religious authority, the acceptance of reason and individualism became the very principles of the Enlightenment that would, in its turn, deeply affect the course of modern political and social thought. The lasting legend and mythology of the Hellfire Club. The politics, hedonism, and intellectualism that so thoroughly intertwined in the Hellfire Club have ensured constant fascination with the organization to this very day. The late 20th century discovery of bodies underneath Franklin's London home added a new layer of intrigue to the story, leading to revived speculation concerning Franklin's involvement in the darker aspects of the club's activities. In fact, the Hellfire Club itself had only a relatively short period of existence, but still it exerted a great influence on British society and culture. What really reflected those tensions of the time between religious orthodoxy and the rise of secular thought, between political conservatism and radical reform, as well as between the public moral codes and private indulgences of the elite, were these secrets. Today, the Hellfire Club is remembered as a symbol of aristocratic license and Enlightenment intellectual license. Its membership, from the enigmatic Benjamin Franklin to those less widely known, continue to stimulate the imagination, not only for their role in the political and intellectual history of the 18th century, but also for their private lives and the darker, often scandalous aspects to these. By and large, the Hellfire Club has left behind a legacy that is a mass of contradictions. It is an institution of these great men who refuse to submit to traditional authority, but wield powerful influence for themselves. A site dedicated to intellectual liberty, it revels in physical license. It reflects and indeed shapes for its time the political and cultural turbulence of 18th century Britain. From secret rituals in secluded abbeys to the corridors of political power, there's no one more enigmatic and scandalous in history than the Hellfire Club. So, if you enjoyed this deep dive into their secret world, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more explorations of the past. There's always more to uncover, and sometimes the most intriguing stories are buried beneath the surface of history. Until next time, my dear spooker, stay curious.